Welcome to Smoke and Mirrors, the podcast where we make sense of agricultural policy. I'm Jenny Ifft, and I teach agricultural policy at Kansas State University. All right, welcome to Smoke and Mirrors, the podcast where we make sense of agricultural policy. I'm Jenny Ifft. I teach agricultural policy at Kansas State University. Today, we'll be continuing a discussion on agricultural labor policy issues. And I'm excited to have Rich Stup from Cornell. He's the director of their agricultural workforce development program and brings a lot of experience working with industry, doing research on labor. Rich, would you like to start off by introducing yourself?
You bet. Thanks, Jenny. I appreciate the opportunity to be on the show with you. So I lead the program here at Cornell, and we have a team of 7 that are full-time essentially, and then a number of others that actually work with us and collaborate on a regular basis. And we cover all things labor is how I put it, So I always describe at least 3 kind of core areas. One is regulation, so both state and federal, just helping farm employers to understand all of the pretty extensive set of laws and regulations they need to follow up on. And be in compliance with. And that can be a really challenging area, a lot going on, especially in New York and a few other states. Second area then is really leadership and management development. That's a true passion of mine, is that, hey, if we're going to be effective in our farms at putting teams together and creating an environment where people are attracted to work and where they want to stay and work for us, it all starts with leadership. We've got to have a good environment. We've got to have people that are thinking about creating that environment and creating that day-to-day work experience. And that's all about the leaders, from the frontline supervisors all the way up to the owners. And then the third is what I call the true workforce development. And that is thinking about the question, where is our workforce coming from 2 years, 5 years, 10 years down the road? And what are the skill sets that they're going to need? And that's a question we ask all the time. It's a pretty hard question to answer a lot of times, but that gets us into areas like, collaborating with colleagues on the more technical side of things, trying to make sure that there are workforce development pipelines and training pipelines in place, trying to help agriculture be better positioned in terms of recruiting people and getting people into the industry. And then also things like the H-2A program. So like the federal guest worker program, and making sure that the regulatory environment is right so that agriculture can participate there and be able to bring in some guest workers. That's kind of what we do at Cornell. My background, I've worked in industry and academia. I've been at Cornell about 8 years now. Prior to that, I was with Farm Credit for about 9 years. And there I led a lot of the financial related services, including consulting, crop insurance, that sort of thing. Prior to that, I was with Penn State University, and I did really management development, human resource management in the dairy industry. And then all the way back early in my career, I was in the feed industry. So it's been a little bit in and out and a lot of research, but throughout that time, always a focus on the people side of agriculture and developing leaders and supervisors.
Yeah. And I remember when we used to work together, and that was over 6 years ago. Now we'd always conclude policy analysis is something with, well, what's really important is you have to be a good employer where people want to work. So
exactly. Without that, nothing else works.
Yep. Exactly. When we do talk about labor, it's a topic that people from all kinds of perspectives can get excited or even emotional about.
For sure.
And for understandable reasons, of course. But I would like you to start off with some facts, some numbers about the industries that you work with to ground our discussion.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so I thought about, what are a couple of facts to help us kind of get grounded. Here's the first couple of pieces. So the H-2A program, which we'll probably talk about a little bit more, but H-2A is the guest worker program where people from many countries can come into the U.S., but the biggest group is from Mexico. Also, in places like New York, it's Jamaica and Guatemala and some other places like that. But H-2A growth has been dramatic. There were less than 100,000 positions certified in H-2A back in 2012. And in 2025, there were almost 400,000 positions certified. So about a 4-fold increase in that about 13-year period of time. So huge increase. That's the first fact to keep in mind. Second one then is just some thoughts about the workforce across agriculture. So US wide, we had about 2.1 million hired farm employees in 2022. That's the census data. That was down from about 2.4 million in 2017. So about 300,000 down U.S.-wide. There were 437,000 operations that hired farm employees in 2022. That was down from 513,000 in 2017. So overall, the number of employees and the number of employers in agriculture had gone down U.S.-wide. In New York, where I'm based, we had 56,678 hired farm employees in 2022, and that was actually up about 1,000 from 2017. And the number of employers went down from 8,963 to 8,028. So in New York, we've actually gained the number of people working on farms, but the number of farm employers actually went down some. So that points us directly at farm consolidation. And we know that's going on. We've got some farms merging. And so, essentially some of those folks that used to own their own farms are probably working on other farms. So that's part of the reason the hired farm numbers went up.
One thing I noticed in this data, it's a good way to get the students that are paying attention on multiple choice questions for the record. But one thing I noticed is that the share of farms that are hiring somebody is actually higher. So human resource management, given these trends that you talked about, is, for the farms that are still making it, it's important.
Yeah. And you bet. And even today, right? So people used to think that, labor management, that's a big farm issue. It's not. What we would consider small and medium, certainly, if it's a commercial farm, it's folks trying to make a living from that farm. Most of them have at least a few employees. So human resource management, labor management that's an issue for most commercial farms these days.
Yeah.
I got one more data point to share.
All right,
Jenny.
let's do it.
Yeah. And so that is farm employee pay in New York. So I do survey compensation in New York. So I have data for New York farm employees showing that frontline farm employees, so the entry-level type employees, averaged about $58,442 in paid wages in 2025. And then total compensation, when we include benefits and bonus, added up to about $71,000 for the frontline folks. Now, they did work a lot of hours. It was about 3,000 hours work to earn that. Middle managers then, so our first line supervisors and the people that are in the middle, often between the farm owner and the frontline employees, they earned close to $74,000 in paid wages. And then total comp was over $94,000 for that group of people. So, I've started increasingly talking about the myth of low paid farm workers, because really those wages are increasingly comparable with a lot of other sectors of the economy. And actually they beat some of them pretty soundly.
Yep. Absolutely. Could you tell us a little bit more about the ag labor in the region that you work in? So, what industries? I know dairy is big. Which employers have the highest labor requirements? Things like that.
Yep. Here in New York, I always talk about the big four and that's the big four sectors of our industry in terms of the number of employees that are here. So we've got a pretty big fruit industry. It's mostly apples, but we got a little bit of everything. We count our fruit industry. And that actually is the biggest employer. That's 28% of hired employees. We're more known as a dairy state in New York, but fruit is big. We are the number 2 apple state, after Washington. We kind of go back and forth with Michigan. But so that's 28%. But do keep in mind, some of that number of employees is short-term seasonal employees. So it's harvest workers that may only be here for a few months. Dairy then represents 24% of our hired farm employees. And of course, they're pretty much all year round. So dairy is a big piece of it there. Next one then is greenhouse and nursery. And people kind of overlook the greenhouses sometimes, but there's a lot of them out there, and there's a lot of people that work in greenhouses. So greenhouses and nursery is 15% of our farm employee population. And then vegetables is 10% of that number. And then it's a whole bunch of others that make up the balance of it. But that's the big four. Yeah. So I guess the apple industry has got some year-round workers because there's some need for work there the whole year round. They do start to ramp up in the spring. There's some pruning work and things that go on. There's a little bit of a lull in the apple industry kind of right now in the middle of the summer. There's not as much going on as the apples are just growing. But then when we hit late August, early September, we really ramp up our number of workers because that's the harvest crews coming in. They're here until late October, early November. Dairy's year round. That's pretty consistent. greenhouse and nursery is close to year round. There certainly is some seasonality. They're more like 9 to 10 months out of the year. And then the vegetable industry, it's really all over the place. Obviously, we're a temperate climate here, so it's we certainly got a winter, so we don't grow any vegetables in wintertime. But vegetable industry really varies. It can be farms of all sizes. It can be really intense hand labor in those vegetable farms, or some of that vegetable farms is fairly well mechanized.
Right. And what is the situation like for employees or people who want to work in agriculture? I can imagine that it's not too hard to find work if you're willing to do it, and that the skills required are changing.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really pretty easy to find work. It has to be folks who are certainly willing to work, sometimes hard work, show up consistently, sometimes get dirty or deal with hot and cold, all those sort of things. It's still farm work. And I would say willing to learn, right? Because increasingly people don't have farm backgrounds, haven't worked in agriculture, but it's certainly learnable. And, some of the entry-level jobs, it's only a few weeks to learn. Some of the more complex jobs, which the door is wide open. So people start at frontline positions and work up into middle manager roles, and sometimes work up all the way into senior manager and ownership even. We have many examples of that, but people that have the ambition can really move ahead in agriculture if they've got some of those qualities, that willingness to work and sometimes deal with some challenging situations. A lot of it's still seasonal. Even on dairy farms that are year round, we still have cropping operations that, the work can be very intense for certain weeks of the year, lots of hours. And then other times it's a lot more moderate pace. Absolutely. With a fruit and vegetable, that's when crops are ready, they have to be harvested when certain operations take place. And that's sometimes something that regulators and legislators who make some of the laws still struggle to understand, is that the pace of farm work, even on larger farms, modern farms, it's not the same as other sectors of the economy where, machines can be turned on and off and factory shifts can be stopped and started relatively easily. If you have growing things and living things, you just can't do that. So it's
non-negotiable.
Easy to find. That's right. So if people have those qualities and are willing to work, there are job opportunities there. Now, the challenges we have are that there's a declining rural population. I have a chart I sometimes use that's just a county map showing the U.S. and showing which counties are growing and which counties are declining. We look around the rural places, generally it's declining, right? We look around the urban places and generally it's growing. Well, since COVID, that got a little bit scrambled and reversed for a while, but I don't think that's changed the long-term trend that the rural places and the people that stay in the rural places aren't the young people necessarily there looking for jobs. And so that affects farms.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Can we attract people from more urban places to come and work in agriculture? That's been tough. We've been trying to do that. And I know different places they've been trying to do that, but it's difficult to do that. Some of it is just familiarity, right? So you grew up in a more urban place. It's hard to imagine living in a rural place and not having all the amenities that you might be used to. But on the other hand, cost of living in rural places is sometimes a fraction of what it is in the more urban places. So, if you can earn a good wage in that rural place and have a cost of living that's much less, I sometimes think if people only knew the quality of the jobs that were available in those rural places, they would move. But they just don't know. And even people that grew up in rural communities, we've had a bit of a disconnection for the last couple of decades between, and I think this is a nationwide issue, between people living in rural communities, not necessarily on farms, just in the rural communities near the farms. It used to be that those kids would get jobs on the farms in the summertime. They were making hay or doing whatever.
Detasseling corn.
Yeah, there you go. That just doesn't happen. Just doesn't happen today at nearly the volume that it used to. And so young people have grown up in the last couple of decades without seeing farms as a source of employment. And I think that's one of the challenges we're dealing with across the country. And we need to reverse that with some of the population to try to rekindle some interest in agriculture as an attractive place for a career and a viable source of employment, and the opportunity to do something real. You're not stuck in a cubicle somewhere. You're actually out there producing something.
Right. Absolutely. Could you talk about what the main challenges for employers are today?
Main
Ag employers?
challenges, yeah, for employers. That first one, attracting people, just enough people to fit into those job roles. Immigration enforcement. This varies
Yeah.
across the country as to how much pressure some of the farm employers have faced. But in some places, including in New York, we have had some enforcement. We've had a few, very few actual raids on farms.
Yeah.
There were some well-publicized ones in California and one well-publicized one in New York. But for the most part, it hasn't been these big dramatic raids. It's been individuals who've been on a list, and ICE has been visiting farms and looking for those individuals by name.
Okay.
So while that hasn't been dramatic in terms of the agricultural workforce, it has certainly stoked a lot of fear because we know there's a portion of the workforce that is not authorized to work here. And so
Yep.
those folks are afraid. And in some cases, they're not able to live their lives like they normally would. They can't go to the store. They can't,
Yep.
sometimes go to their kids' school or go to the doctor's office if they need to. And so that really has an impact on people's quality of life. And certainly
Yeah.
the employees, for obvious reasons, but also the employers. So we have to remember that some of our immigrant employees have been here for 10, 15, 20, or 30 years. They've become really close with the other folks on those farms, including the owners. And it's hugely stressful to think that some of your key employees could be swept up at any moment's notice. So that's a huge issue that's really affecting agriculture. Here in New York, more locally, we have overtime, which has really been an ongoing issue for the last 7 years. We fortunately, we do have, and I'll get into this a little bit later, but we do have a tax refund that helps to cover the cost of that. But it's certainly a big issue that makes our cost of labor a lot more expensive than some of the surrounding states. We've got a variety of other worker-focused labor laws, some union-friendly rules that make it difficult, I'll say really especially for some of the smaller employers to be in compliance. I mentioned the smaller employers because, if you're a big employer and you got 50 or 100 employees on your farm, you probably have some HR. You probably have a person whose responsibility is in HR management. If you've got 10 employees, you don't, because you can't afford that. But you still have to comply. You still have to comply with all of these regulations, and it can be really tough for those smaller farms. And then here's another issue that I think is not as well known, but just the overall labor issues, some of the concerns that we've been talking about, it's becoming more and more of an issue for succession planning. So we've got this generation in place that's been managing the labor issue. They've been growing farms. They've added on more employees, and then they're dealing with extra regulations. They're dealing with immigration enforcement and all these challenges. And we have that next generation coming along, and they're looking at this and saying, do I really want to do that? Is it worth it to me to take over the farm and have to deal with all of these really challenging labor issues, including that big one of, am I going to be able to have enough people to meet our labor needs going forward? And it's causing people, I think, in that next generation to really think hard and possibly choose not to come into the farm business and take over. And so I think it's kind of a hidden consequence. It's a challenge that's increasingly part of those farm succession conversations.
Yeah. I think I know out here in Kansas, farm transition is also a big challenge. We have an office that is dedicated to it, and they're way more in demand than economists, so you can take that for what it's worth. But I'd like to dig into some of these. I know you talked about immigration enforcement and increasing use of H-2A, and you've done quite a bit of work on H-2A, right?
Absolutely, yeah. Because again, we've been working with the seasonal employers for years since I've been here, and it's when I first arrived, H-2A was primarily the larger seasonal employers, the apple growers, that a lot of them were already using H-2A and have been for a long time. But we've been working with a lot of the mid-size and sometimes smaller employers for the last 8 years, helping them to learn H-2A and get into the program. So we've continued to grow here in New York. But what's been the big kind of innovation in the last, I'll say, 4 or 5 years has been dairy and some other permanent year-round employers using H-2A where they can for some of their seasonal work, like crop operations and that sort of thing, as much as possible. it's important to remember H2A is supposed to be temporary or seasonal. And so, year-round type jobs are generally not eligible for H2A. But some dairy jobs are crop operations. So that's increasingly, we've had dairies getting in and using H2A. But now, just this year, there's been some, I'll call it a policy clarification at the federal level.
Yeah,
There was
that was a little confusing to me, actually.
The policy memorandum that came out. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let me talk about that just for a minute. So there's two things going on. So there's proposed legislation at the federal level. Now, it's proposed and they're talking about it, but it hasn't gone anywhere. Nobody's passed anything. Nobody signed anything. But that would be an H2A reform that really would open the doors up to year-round employers. But until that's law, that's meaningless, right? Until we have a law passed, that's. But what did happen was that USCIS, so the agency that is in charge of ICE and border crossings and all that, they had a policy memorandum, so again, no rule changes. The policy memorandum just clarified that, in fact, year-round employers like dairy are eligible for H2A to get H2A employees if they have seasonal or temporary jobs. That was kind of a big clarification because, 15 years ago, if you had a dairy farm, it was automatic no. You couldn't use H2A for anybody. But the door's kind of been creeping open a little bit more as the years go by. And this policy memorandum made it clear and explicit dairies and other year-round employers can participate. And all it has to be is that part of the job has to be seasonal or temporary. So, for example, and this is all kind of developing, but for example, we have a lot of snow removal sometimes to do in a state like New York. If you had employees that part of their job was seasonal snow removal and part of their job was milking cows, that would theoretically qualify.
That's okay. Now that catches my attention.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Here's another example. So we've had a lot of investment in the dairy industry here in New York. And so dairy farms are expanding because we expect to have a lot more market demand. So let's say you've expanded your dairy and you expect that in the next year, you're going to have a temporary increase in your labor demand. Well, guess what? You could temporarily bring people in to milk cows and do those year-round type jobs. It's just the nature of how long that demand is going to be. So if it's temporary, it will qualify. That's kind of the doors squeaked open just a little bit wider with that clarification.
Yeah. And I think, there's been so many proposed ag immigration reform bills.
Right.
And I think all of them add year-round workers for operations like dairy farms. That seems to be one of the easier parts of it. So
yeah. And this has been an innovative. Some of the earlier proposals included immigration reform. That proposal that I mentioned earlier that's out there to make H2A available for year-round employers, it's actually not immigration reform. That's an interesting point because H2A is not immigration, right? It's temporary or seasonal workers. So they come in, they work for a while, and then they go home. So they're not immigrants. They're just temporary workers. So that's one of the big differences between that new proposal that's out there and previous proposal, which did have actual immigration reform included in it. So
that's a good clarification.
Yeah. So we were talking about some of those policies. That was one of them.
Well, a lot of the policies in New York, you talked about the overtime, union-related laws. These are policies where New York is not the only state. It varies by state, and some states choose to have more stringent laws.
That's right. And there's even there's a conference called it's the National Council for Ag Employers. There's a conference each year, and they have a panel that recurs, and they call it the Canaries in the Coal Mine panel. And they get people to come from California and New York and sometimes places like Washington State. And it's canaries in the coal mine because they're looking at these states that tend to have more progressive, more sometimes restrictive labor laws that come along. But when California and New York do it, and believe me, the California and New York folks are always talking to each other and comparing what their laws and strategies are, then it tends to be that states like Washington and Oregon and sometimes Michigan and the New England states follow along in the next couple of years. So overtime's on the table. Colorado even has an overtime law in place now. So it is something I think for the other states to be aware of, some of the change in some of those other states. But when you're working in agriculture in a state like New York, we need to be constantly aware of the cost of some of those policies too. And that's, the industry made a really good point when overtime first came in with New York State, because New York State, overtime initially came in at 60 hours. And then there was a process, it was a wage board, in fact, and there was a whole bunch of hearings and really controversial hearings between farm groups and worker advocacy groups and unions and so forth. But the upshot of that was that the overtime wage will go down the threshold, the threshold. So the number of hours per week at which overtime begins to be required. It initially was at 60 hours per week. It's going down 4 hours every 2 years so that we'll get to 40 hours in 2032. Right now, this year, we're at 52 hours. So overtime starts at 52 hours. By 2032, it will start at 40 hours. So overtime at 60 hours wasn't a huge competitive problem for New York versus surrounding states, which, they don't have any overtime requirement.
Right.
Because most farm employees worked somewhere around 50 or 55 or 60 hours. But, if we were at 40 hours and Pennsylvania and Ohio and Michigan, they had no overtime, then that's going to make the cost of labor far more expensive in New York than it would be in some of those other states. So what New York did is put in this tax refund. And what it does is that New York State essentially subsidizes the costs of the overtime premium that farm employers are required to pay between the threshold, which is 52 now, up to 60 hours a week. If they work more than 60 hours a week, the farm employer has to pay all of that. But if it's between the threshold and 60, then the state essentially covers that. So that is huge.
Is this permanent?
So yes and no, right? So it's put in as a tax refund, and it is not something then that they have to approve in the budget every year. So that it's just automatically there. A future legislature and governor could easily take it out. And that's the big concern the industry has, is that it could be taken out. There's no sunset, so sometimes there's a law, there'll be a date at which it sunsets, but this one has no sunset into it. So presumably it's permanent as long as they don't change that. I'll give you a contrast though. California has no such tax refund. So all the overtime that's required in California is paid by the employers. And guess what? On the farms I've been to in California, when they hit 40 hours a week or 8 hours a day, because they have a daily overtime, they stop working. They just hire enough people so that they don't have to have overtime, or they strictly limit the overtime hours, which is a surprise to no one, Jenny, because there's tons of data out there that shows that employers will avoid overtime if they can in any possible way. They will avoid overtime because it's expensive.
Right.
That's right. Math.
So are some farm employees, if they want extra hours, do they go work on a second nearby farm? Are you starting to see things like that?
In places like California and Washington, there's data showing that. In fact, Allie Hill recently put some articles out that really illustrate that increasingly people are at their individual jobs are seeing reduced pay. And then anecdotally, we do know that people are finding second jobs, which they need to, right? So they used to be able to work 60 hours at this one farm and earn enough. Now they can only get 40 hours, so they got to go somewhere else to find some work. Contrast that here in New York, where we do have that tax refund in place. They're getting the overtime. So, guys are working, 52 hours is when the threshold starts. They're easily getting 52 hours. There's lots of farms where they're still working 60 and 65 hours.
Yeah.
So the tax refund means that they're actually getting the overtime. So the upshot here in New York is that we've got pretty highly paid farm employees. And I think that because of the tax refund and because these employees here do get the overtime, we're going to be increasingly one of the highest paid, if not the highest paying state for farm employees, which raises the question, again, theoretically, do we start to attract labor then from?
Yeah. In one place.
That's right.
Yeah. Yeah, that's pretty interesting. So one of the challenges is just finding enough people. So, H2A has been a part of that puzzle for increasingly smaller, mid-sized farms. What else are farm employers doing to sort of get creative on finding a
Dealing with
workforce?
that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, to get
No silver
creative on
bullet,
finding,
as far as I understand.
that's right. Right. People always want the silver bullet. And I have to say, I often get the question, right? How do I find more employees? How do I find more people to fill these jobs? And Jenny, it's the question that I hate the most, right? Because there is no silver bullet. There's no simple answer. H2A is a partial answer for some people. It can help in the right circumstances, but it's by no means the answer for everybody. It's expensive. The program is difficult, and some people aren't even eligible for it. We've got certainly some kind of immigration reform would be extremely helpful, and it's extremely necessary, but we're not there yet. That takes legislation at the federal level, and we all know that's tough. That's hard to make that happen. What people are doing is getting better as employers. They're starting to think more about the quality of the jobs that they offer. They're thinking more about, in New York, a lot of the farm employers provide housing, especially for immigrant employees. And we've been really focusing on the quality of that housing. There's been, I call it a little housing boom in New York, because farms have been building purpose-built housing for both individuals and for families on the farm, because, rural housing is sometimes very hard to come by. And so they're doing that partly because, it's needed, but partly because it makes them a more attractive employer. And so they can better draw in workers and retain workers if they got great quality housing for folks. Making sure that they are offering benefits that are in demand and things like that. Making sure that they have a safe place to work. Make sure that the hours are reasonable. And of course, making sure that there's an opportunity to earn pay and to have a, good work-life balance and a good quality of life when they are working there. And so those are all things but it's easy to talk about. It's much harder to make them happen in reality.
Right. Well, there's also an element of culture, which isn't numbers.
Right.
So I'm a little less comfortable with it, but it seems like just having a place where people like to work matters quite a bit too. It's not just always dollars and cents.
Absolutely. Dollars and cents matter, right? So
absolutely.
What I always tell people is that you can't be below the market and attract and retain people. If you're below the market, if they can go down the road and earn a lot more than they can at your place, you might be the greatest place to work, but if you're out of the market, then you're not going to be able to retain people. So you got to be in the ballpark. You got to be competitive. You don't have to be the highest paid. But when people come to work at your place, if people talk to each other, they enjoy each other, they maybe have a little bit of fun at work, the boss smiles from time to time, they get shown some respect, as human beings, versus another workplace where everybody's grumpy all the time. It's all about work. It's hot and miserable. The tools and equipment are always broken, and nobody cares about getting it fixed up. The housing is poor quality. Then guess what? You're going to be a revolving door. And so, individual farms can really build a culture where they show respect to the employees. And so that respect is by, creating an environment that's good to work in, that's safe, that's good housing, all that stuff. That they try to, if there's a language barrier, they try to overcome that. They make steps and efforts to do that. They keep people informed. They say, hey, I appreciate your work. That's a good job. Keep up that good work, and here's the opportunity for you to grow in that job. All those things, they really add up over time. And I really think that one of the things that we're seeing, as we have seen consolidation and growth in various industries, is that some of the farms are really starting to figure out leadership and human resources. And they are starting to separate themselves from the other farms that haven't, that think it's all about the paycheck and people should be grateful for a job when they come to work for me. And those farms that are able to attract and keep the best employees, they're going to perform better. They're going to be more efficient. They're going to have lower costs. They're going to have higher productivity versus the other farm where people don't seem to care. Their costs are going to be higher. They have the revolving door. They've got more training costs. People are going to break things more often in those environments. And that separation, it's hard to quantify, Jenny, but it's becoming more and more apparent.
Well, maybe have you looked at it in terms of herd health with dairies? I mean, maybe some management practices and
yeah, I mean, I can't
that's
say
really sensitive to management and how workers are doing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We've seen Cornell has been tracking the dairy industry and does a great job every year of collecting data on a lot of same farms data.
Yeah.
And, we've been, of course, looking at labor costs, and for all those issues, increasing minimum wage, overtime, all that stuff, we know labor costs has been going up. So we've been watching that. But some of these farms have also been increasing productivity per cow. They've been increasing milk production per cow. They've been increasing not just overall production, but also, quality factors from that milk that they're producing. And they've actually offset a lot of the increasing costs of that labor with improving productivity and better quality. And yeah, so I think we're seeing those factors come through. You got a better workforce, you can do those things. So even if you retain people, and over time, if you retain people, their wages tend to go up as well. Even if you have a higher overall cost of labor, but you more than offset that with reduced expenses and increased productivity, you're ahead. You can have a higher cost labor force and just have more income as a result from it.
And have you seen or worked with individual farms who have been able to go in and change their culture and management style?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And some of that is really just learning, some of the basics of what motivates people. What are the factors that create that excellent culture? And we know lots of these things. People are people, and it doesn't matter whether it's agriculture or other industries. There's a ton of research that we've been able to pull together on that. And actually, one of the things that we've really developed in the last few years is a series of online courses we call Agricultural Supervisory Leadership. And there's nothing else quite comparable anywhere else in the country to these courses. But Ag Supervisory Leadership is exactly what it sounds like. It's like, if I'm leading people in a farm setting, what are those skills and tools that I need to do that? And, most people have come up in agriculture, we learned the production side of the business, or maybe we learned some of the financial side of the business, but mostly it was production. It was crops. It was cows. It was that sort of stuff. It was machinery and equipment. Nobody was really learning about how do I lead people? That wasn't part of the discussion. And so now a lot of people don't have those skills, but we've developed these courses, and we've had people from all over the country participating in that. And we've actually I mentioned some of these farms that seem to really be getting it. We've got some farms now that have incorporated the courses into their management development for their farm. So essentially they're saying, hey, if you want to progress in your career at this farm, and there's opportunity to do so, you need to take these courses and learn that basic set of skills. And yes, we're hearing from middle managers and senior managers about how just learning these skills and applying some of them. You don't have to apply everything at once. It's start applying some and begin to make a difference there. It does change the culture. How do we do a better job training? How do we do a better job onboarding new employees? How do we have team meetings that are relevant, and communicate well with when we start doing little things like that, they become big things, and people appreciate that. And they feel like they're part of something that's important, like they're part of a team that's winning.
Are there any other policies or regulations that you spend a lot of time helping farms adapt with, work with?
Yeah, a lot. That's a long list, right?
Any you'd like to highlight? The ones that come to the top?
Yeah, a couple of those. So we mentioned certainly overtime. That's one we've spent a fair amount of time on. H2A has been a big one this year, again, partly because of that door opening up some. We've started doing these monthly, what we call office hours. So every month we pick a topic. Sometimes it's a really narrow focus topic. Sometimes it's a bigger topic. I usually facilitate, and we'll have sometimes one, sometimes two or three guests that come in, and we'll talk for a little bit about a certain issue. It might be sick leave was something that we talked about recently, and that's complicated here in New York. The next one we're doing in August is really going to focus on H2A for permanent employers. So we'll do that, and then we open it up wide for questions from the audience. And so it is an office hour. It gives them a chance to really focus on a topic learn some, and then ask some follow-up questions. This has been quite popular. So that's one of the things that we do. We also coordinate really closely with industry on what we call the Labor Roadshow. And that's an in-person thing that we essentially have a roadshow. We travel around the state and we address, the hottest topics, hottest labor topics that are coming up. And so we get into all of those areas. We've been, as we have overtime coming in, we have increased costs. We've got more and more employers saying, well, how do I become more efficient? And one of the things we've been working on, especially with our dairy industry, is lean systems or lean management. So some folks have heard of that from manufacturing environments, but there's actually been some good applications of that kind of philosophy or way of leading people and managing that's been brought into agriculture. And we've been teaching that and helping owners and managers do a better job of figuring out what their systems are, where there might be some waste, and finding ways to make improvements on a continuous basis so that they can constantly be getting better, constantly higher quality, constantly higher productivity, really in order to offset some of the labor challenges that they have.
I think I first heard that term from you or Jason. So,
well, probably so, because Jason's been talking about it for quite a long time. Yeah. We've kind of ramped it up in the last couple of years. I'll tell you, there's another one then that has to do with technology coming in. So, of course, AI is like every other news story that comes out. And I don't know about you, but I've been hard pressed to just even keep up with all the technologies in the last year or two. It's like, well, what is happening, and how is AI changing something over here? And well, we're certainly seeing more and more AI in agriculture, and it really is everywhere. But we've had some other talk a little bit more generally than AI. We've got sensors on everything, and this is whether it's dairy, whether it's field crops, whether it's specialty crops here, and increasingly these sensors and the ability to use that data, that's having a big impact on labor. And I want to explain how. So originally when I was thinking about, technology as a way to augment or save labor or perhaps even replace labor, everybody's thinking, the robots, right? The robots are coming. The robots are going to milk cows. They're going to pick apples. They're going to do this and that and the other thing. Well, yes, we have robots milking cows, but there's some, as you know, some economic challenges there because they're super expensive. The robots to pick apples and do other things, that's been a little bit tougher because, it's an engineering problem. They'll solve it eventually, but people don't want a bruised apple. They want they want a nice, clean, fresh apple there. But it's not so much about robots, at least at this stage, replacing labor. It's about gathering data and using that data to help us use the labor we do have in a very efficient way. So I'll give you a couple examples. So we used to go in, and I'll give an apple example. We used to, or even a vineyard example. We used to go in, and if there was a fungus showing up in there, we'd have to spray the whole orchard. And that takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of spray. It takes a lot of labor. Well, now with increasing sensor technology and detection of where things, where spray needs to be applied, we can use a lot less spray, a lot less labor, and a more precise application. So that's like smart use of that labor. Dairy has an even clearer example of that, is that, increasingly we're monitoring cows more closely. It's we're monitoring when they're milked, when they come through the parlor. We're monitoring them with either it's a leg monitor or it's an ear tag monitor, a neck monitor, whatever. And they're gathering a lot of data about this animal and her health status or reproductive status. And, if I can, it used to be that, I'm the herd manager, and we used to have to sort out 10 cows, and we'd have to go and examine those 10 cows. Well, now we're only sorting out 2 cows because we've got this data that tells us, those other 8 cows, they're fine. They just, she's just in heat or whatever it might be, and we don't need to sort her out. She's okay. And wow, Jenny, that saves a ton of labor.
I could believe
it. Helps us, much more precisely allocate where that skilled labor is used.
And I can't, just to say, dairy cow health, this is something I can't articulate it that well, but I gained a lot of appreciation for it during my time at Cornell. Just how important it is for profitability, how keeping them healthy and comfortable is hard.
Yeah.
And it requires a lot of attention to detail and some, I don't know if art is the right word as well, but some real knowledge. It's
art is a
big deal.
There used to be they used to talk about having cow sense, right? So,
Yeah.
it took years of experience to develop that cow sense. And years ago, I worked with some colleagues when I was at Penn State, and we took that as a challenge, and we actually developed some training because, well, yeah, there's cow sense means the ability to look at a group of cows and figure out which one needs some attention and which ones are okay. And we figured out, okay, yeah, we can teach that. There's certain things that people are doing. We can teach that. But, now we've got these technology tools and that's got pretty good cow sense. It hasn't replaced that human factor, hasn't replaced that art. I mean, that having a good skilled cow person is still a wonderful thing to have. But
yeah. And with these tools, they can be better. Is that?
Exactly. And so, that really skilled employee, again, if he's only looking at 2 cows and can give a little bit more attention and focus there because he doesn't have 10 cows that he has to look at, that's a real gain.
Is there a part of your work that you feel like is frequently misunderstood?
So part of my work that is frequently misunderstood.
Or occasionally.
Yeah, or occasionally. Yeah, okay, I appreciate that. That leadership piece.
Mm-hmm.
Leadership. Again, some people sometimes say culture, and culture is important, but let's understand it for what it is. Leaders create the culture, so it's they're kind of synonymous. I really think teaching frontline supervisors, those people that are making that transition from being an individual performer to it's the first time that I'm leading people. That's a huge transition, and we struggle with it in agriculture, but it's not, by no means is that unique to agriculture, Jenny. That is the same
I
everywhere.
want you to do your course for academics, so I get it, personally.
And that is not the first time I've heard that in a university context.
I believe it. We're not trained for this.
Yeah, not everybody, but most people struggle in that transition from individual performer to first-time supervisor. And mostly it's because, the tools and practices and skills that made you successful as an individual performer are not the same as the skills that will make you successful as a leader. And so it's just a matter of learning those skills and learning how to use them. That can help. And really, anybody can be a leader. You don't have to be some charismatic person. You don't have to be an extrovert or some kind. That all doesn't matter. Anybody can develop their own leadership style and be effective as a leader. And that's really what we teach in those ag supervisor leadership courses. But I think a lot of times that is misunderstood. And I'm so passionate about that partly because it affects everything else too. We talked about culture a little bit. You need those leaders to create that culture. If we want to, here, we didn't talk about it too much, but in New York, it's possible to form unions on farms. Well, in most other states, that's not even allowable by law, but it is here in New York. The best defense for a farm employer against having a union form in the farm is just to have a great place to work, just to have leaders that respect the employees and take care of people and make sure things are done right day in and day out, and that nobody's being harassed and that people are, enjoying their work and things like that. That's by far the best defense. So just having leaders in place who know what they're about, who can connect their day-to-day leadership with the goals of the farm. I mean, if you could do that, what are we trying to accomplish this year? What makes this farm successful? Okay, leaders take that and they put it into day-to-day practice. And that's, again, I know it's so easy to say that, but the reality is that's the secret sauce that it takes to make a farm really, really effective. So yeah, I think that's frequently misunderstood. And people decide, well, I want to do a better job with compliance. Well, if you got leaders in there that know what they're about, they can do a better job with compliance because they're going to make sure that people aren't being harassed at work. If you have people that don't care about being effective as leaders, they're also not going to care about whether employees are being harassed or not. So you see what I'm driving at is that if you want to have good compliance, you got to start with good leaders. The other piece that not inside of agriculture, people understand that compensation within agriculture can be, pretty solid and pretty good. I get a chance from time to time to talk with audiences outside of agriculture. And a lot of times they're shocked. They're shocked to learn the actual data that, hey, people really do get paid pretty well in agriculture. Sometimes I talk to the advocacy groups and they'll be talking about, how people are so low paid and things like that. And And it's often because they're misinterpreting the data that they have available to them. But when I share with them how much people are actually paid, they'll be shocked to hear some of those numbers, and sometimes they don't believe them. So I think that's another area that's often misunderstood.
All right, last question I ask everybody. You get to change one policy. What is it?
Yeah, that's an easy one for me. If I could change that one, it would be immigration reform, right? We know we've got a significant portion of the workforce that is not authorized to work here. And, that's been throughout started my career in the mid to late 90s, and the immigrant workforce was really starting to ramp up at that point. And there through the late 90s and early 2000s, there was a huge immigration that came into the country. And frankly, a lot of those folks are still here and have been here again for multiple decades, not authorized to work. And a lot of our farms across sectors and across regions of the country today are very dependent on a workforce that is not authorized to work in the U.S. And, I've been saying for at least 20 years, how sustainable is it for us to have an industry that's dependent on an unauthorized workforce? Well, after 20 years, I'm starting to question myself. I'm like, well, maybe it's pretty sustainable, because it's been this long. But it still doesn't change the underlying factor, that we've got farms and farm employees that really are in kind of a precarious situation because they're not authorized. And so I think as an industry, but more broadly, Jenny, as a country, we need to take this issue seriously because it's an important part of our overall economy. It's certainly an important part of our rural economy. It's certainly, we're talking about our food supply, which, many people often make the point that our food supply is a national security interest for our country. And so we need to be reasonable. And I think I know that reasonable people could sit down in a room and solve this problem in a way that would work for most citizens, and that would make sense for most of the citizens in this country. And so if we could just get the politics out of it for just a little while and have cooler heads work on a workable solution that allowed some legal immigration to meet the needs of agriculture, that also allowed a temporary guest worker a program that helps to meet the needs of agriculture, because not everybody wants to immigrate. Some people just want to come and work here.
Right.
We could do this, but it's politics that has prevented that from happening.
But I mean, time and time again, the representatives of employers and employees have sat in a room and figured this out.
They have.
And as you well know, these are not groups that always see eye to eye.
Exactly.
The situation is bad enough. They've sat in a room and figured it out. And then there have been bills, but there's the broader politics there. So
the actual interested, involved parties have already reached compromise on multiple times, but the politicians can't get it done.
Yep. All right. Well, Rich, I really appreciate having you. And I also really like, this podcast is about making sense of policy. So obviously policy is important, but at the end of the day, everybody has to get on and run a business and, get on with our lives. And you're helping people do that. So I really appreciate that.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And again, I appreciate the opportunity to be on and to reconnect with you, Jenny. And anytime you want to have me back, I'm glad to join you.
I'm sure we're going to continue to have plenty to talk about. I appreciate it. Thanks so much for joining this episode of Smoke and Mirrors as we dig into the policies driving food and agriculture today and in the future.